The Amish are known for their simple lifestyle, strong faith, and commitment to tradition. But behind the peaceful image of horse-drawn buggies and handmade quilts, there's a world where their way of life sometimes clashes with modern laws. While they don't always intend to break the rules, some Amish communities find themselves on the wrong side of regulations due to their strong beliefs and cultural practices. The relationship between the Amish and firearms might surprise those who view these communities as purely pacifist. Let me paint you a picture that's quite different from what most folks imagine when they think of Amish country. While you won't find any tactical gear or fancy gun safes in these humble homes, what you will find tucked away in many Amish households is a trusty hunting rifle, though often without the paperwork that modern law requires. Now, you might be wondering why a community known for peace and simplicity would even want firearms. Well, when your livelihood depends on protecting your livestock from predators and putting food on the table through hunting, a rifle becomes less of a weapon and more of a tool. Kind of like a hammer or a plow, just with a bit more kick to it. These aren't your run-of-the-mill budget guns either. The Amish typically invest in high-quality firearms that can be passed down through generations, treating them with the same respect they give all their carefully chosen possessions. But here's where things get interesting, and technically illegal. Many Amish gun owners skip the whole registration process, viewing it as an unnecessary entanglement with government bureaucracy. It's not that they're trying to be rebellious, it's more like they're sticking to their grandfather's way of doing things. Think of it as using a family recipe instead of following the cooking instructions on the box. Except this particular recipe could land you in hot water with the law. A 2019 police investigation in rural Ohio pulled back the curtain on just how widespread this practice is. They discovered that a significant portion of Amish families were keeping unregistered firearms, many of which were being used for hunting. It's kind of like finding out your quiet neighbor who never speeds and always returns borrowed tools has been driving without a license all along. Technically wrong, but not exactly threatening. The Amish approach to gun ownership reflects their broader philosophy about government involvement in their lives. They prefer to keep it at arm's length. They store their firearms in less accessible areas, treating them with respect but also with discretion. It's a bit like having a secret family heirloom, except this one could get you more than just disapproving looks from the relatives. The legal risks aren't small potatoes either. Getting caught with an unregistered firearm can lead to serious fines and even criminal charges. But for many Amish families, these risks are outweighed by their commitment to self-sufficiency and traditional practices. Besides, they figure if their great-grandfather never needed a piece of paper to own a rifle, why should they? This situation highlights a fascinating tension between modern regulations and traditional ways of life. While the rest of us are filling out forms in triplicate and waiting for background checks, these communities are operating on a system of trust and tradition that's worked for them for generations. Sure, it might not be strictly legal, but it's a reminder that sometimes the letter of the law doesn't quite capture the complexity of different ways of life. Speaking of keeping the government at arm's length, firearms aren't the only thing the Amish prefer to handle their own way. When it comes to health and medicine, they have some pretty interesting and equally questionable practices of their own. Let's just say their medicine cabinets look a lot different from yours, and the FDA probably wouldn't approve. When you think of medicine, you probably imagine white-coated doctors, sterile hospitals, and those little orange prescription bottles. But in Amish country, healthcare takes on a whole different flavor. Quite literally. Instead of hitting up the pharmacy, many Amish families are reaching for herbs from their gardens, brewing special teas, and following healing practices that would make modern medical boards raise their eyebrows to the ceiling. Picture this. You've got a nasty cold. While most of us would be loading up on Dayquil, an Amish family might be brewing a potent mixture of garlic, honey, and who knows what else from Grandma's secret recipe book. And you know what? Sometimes these remedies work wonders. Though good luck getting the FDA to admit that. It's like having a pharmaceutical company in your backyard, except instead of scientists in lab coats, you've got wisdom passed down through generations. But here's where things start walking a tightrope between tradition and legality. Some Amish communities have their own healthcare practitioners who work completely outside the modern medical system. These folks aren't licensed doctors or nurses. They're more like traditional healers who've learned their craft through apprenticeship and experience. While they might know every medicinal plant in a 10-mile radius, they're technically practicing medicine without a license. The situation gets even trickier when it comes to selling these remedies. You see, federal law has some pretty strict rules about making health claims for untested treatments. That bottle of Grandma's Surefire Cough Cure might work great, but sell it at your local market without proper FDA approval, and you could find yourself in hot water faster than you can brew a cup of chamomile tea. Then there's the whole vaccination debate. Many Amish communities have traditionally opted out of vaccination programs, citing religious beliefs. During disease outbreaks, this can create some serious tension with public health officials. It's like having two different worlds trying to operate in the same space, one running on modern medical science, the other on traditional beliefs and natural remedies. The most controversial aspect might be their approach to emergency care. Some Amish families prefer to handle serious medical situations within their community rather than heading to the hospital. This isn't because they're against modern medicine entirely. It's more about maintaining their independence and following their religious beliefs. But when things go wrong, this choice can lead to legal troubles, especially if children are involved. What makes this whole situation fascinating is how the Amish navigate these challenges. They're not completely anti-modern medicine. Many will seek professional care for serious injuries or illnesses, but they prefer to handle things their way first, using treatments that have served their communities for generations. It's like having a backup generator when the power goes out. Except in this case, the backup is actually their first choice. The only product we'll ever promote on our channel is a book by Claude Davis, a veteran prepper, about 126 superfoods and preservation methods from crisis times like the Great Depression and wartime that are impossible to find elsewhere. We decided to promote his book because we are the last generation able to share these techniques and superfoods to our children or grandchildren. It would be a shame to see this information about highly nutritious foods and preservation methods to survive crises disappear. You can also find a book about herbal remedies from Nicole Apelian on their store. If you're watching this on TV, you can look up our channel, Frugal Solutions, on your phone or tablet and find the books by clicking the link in our channel description or any other video description. The legal risks are real, though. From selling unregistered herbal remedies to practicing unlicensed healthcare, these traditional methods exist in a gray area that could lead to fines or worse. But for many Amish, the risk is worth maintaining their traditional approach to healing and healthcare. And speaking of traditional practices that raise legal eyebrows, wait until you hear about what some Amish communities are brewing up in their barns. Let's just say their drink menu might be a bit stronger than the herbal tea we just talked about. You might think the Amish are all about quiet Sunday gatherings and modest living, but some communities have a little secret bubbling away in their barns. And I'm not talking about apple cider. While most Amish folks avoid alcohol altogether, there's a fascinating underground world of homemade wines, ciders, and yes, even moonshine that would make any Prohibition-era bootlegger tip their hat in respect. Now, let's be clear. We're not talking about some mass production operation here. These are small batch traditional recipes that have been passed down through families like precious heirlooms, the kind of drinks that Grandpa might have made in his day using fruits from the family orchard or grains from last year's harvest. It's craft brewing at its most authentic, though unfortunately also at its most illegal. The real kicker came in 2020 when police in rural Ohio stumbled upon what you might call an Amish speakeasy situation. Several families were found to be producing and selling homemade moonshine to neighboring communities. It wasn't exactly a criminal empire, more like a friendly neighborhood service that happened to be completely unlicensed and, well, illegal. Think of it as a farmer's market for forbidden fruits, if you catch my drift. What makes this whole situation particularly interesting is the motivation behind it. For most Amish brewers, it's not about making a quick buck or running some underground booze empire. It's about maintaining traditions and, in some cases, providing for religious ceremonies. These aren't your typical bootleggers. They're more like accidental outlaws, carrying on practices that were perfectly normal before modern licensing laws came along. The process itself is quite impressive, even if it's not exactly legal. Using traditional methods and equipment that would make a modern craft brewer jealous, these Amish families create drinks that some say rival commercial products. Of course, without proper testing and regulation, you're taking quite a risk sampling these backyard brews. It's like playing Russian roulette with your taste buds. Though the Amish's reputation for quality craftsmanship usually extends to their moonshine too. The legal consequences for getting caught aren't just a slap on the wrist either. We're talking serious fines and potential jail time for producing and selling alcohol without proper licensing. But in tight-knit Amish communities where traditional practices often trump modern regulations, these risks are sometimes seen as just another part of maintaining their way of life. What's particularly fascinating is how these operations stay under the radar. In communities where everyone knows everyone else's business, keeping a moonshine still secret is quite a feat. It's like having a community-wide game of don't tell the English. That's what the Amish call non-Amish folks, by the way. The whole thing operates on trust, discretion, and probably more than a few well-timed barn doors closing just as visitors arrive. And speaking of things hidden behind barn doors, you'd be surprised at what else some Amish communities are keeping out of sight. Ever wonder how those handmade furniture pieces make it to markets 50 miles away? Let's just say some Amish don't use the horse and buggy like it should be. Let's talk about those iconic horse-drawn buggies that seem to perfectly capture the Amish way of life. While most of us are dealing with license plate renewals and registration fees, the Amish are clip-clopping down country roads in vehicles that technically don't need either. But this old-school transportation choice is stirring up some surprisingly modern problems. Here's the thing about those charming buggies. They're creating quite a headache for local governments, and not just because they slow down traffic on busy roads. Those steel wheels and horse hooves are literally leaving their mark on public roads, causing damage that costs thousands of dollars to repair. It's like having a house guest who refuses to use coasters. Sure, they're living by their principles, but somebody's got to deal with those marks on the coffee table. The Amish view their buggies as essential tools rather than vehicles that need government oversight. No engine, no registration needed. It's a clever loophole that allows them to maintain their traditional lifestyle while avoiding the bureaucratic red tape that comes with modern transportation. Think of it as living in a regulatory blind spot. Not quite illegal, but definitely raising some eyebrows at the county office. But here's where things get interesting. While these buggies dodge registration fees and vehicle taxes, they're creating a financial burden for communities. Local governments are stuck with repair bills for damaged roads. And guess who's footing the bill? That's right, the non-Amish taxpayers. Some counties report spending significant portions of their road maintenance budgets just fixing damage caused by horse-drawn buggies. It's like having a neighbor who never chips in for the block party, but always shows up to eat. The situation has created some tension in areas with large Amish populations. Local officials argue that the Amish should contribute to road maintenance costs since they use public roads just like everyone else. After all, a pothole is a pothole, whether it was caused by a Chevy or a horse-drawn buggy. Some communities have tried to implement special permits or fees for buggies, but these efforts often clash with the Amish's religious freedoms and traditional practices. The Amish perspective is straightforward. They're already living simply and causing less environmental impact than motor vehicles. They maintain that their buggies are part of their religious practice, and requiring registration or special fees would infringe on their religious freedom. It's a bit like being the only vegetarian at a barbecue and being asked to chip in for the meat. From their viewpoint, why should they pay for a system they're trying to avoid? And speaking of avoiding modern systems, wait until you hear about what's happening in Amish dairy farms. Those delicious cheeses and fresh milk products might make your mouth water, but the FDA is getting a bit sour about how they're made. Ever heard of a $100,000 fine for a single wheel of cheese? Well, that's the kind of trouble Amish dairy farmers can find themselves in when dealing with raw milk products. You see, while most of us are drinking milk that's been heated, processed, and packaged to meet FDA standards, many Amish farmers are sticking to tradition. And that tradition involves raw milk straight from the cow. Now, here's where things get interesting. Federal law actually makes it illegal to transport raw milk across state lines. It's treated almost like contraband. Imagine getting pulled over and having to explain why you've got gallons of unpasteurized milk in your trunk. But the Amish have found some creative ways to keep their dairy traditions alive, including something called cow share programs. Think of cow shares as a timeshare, but instead of getting a week at a beach condo, you're getting raw milk from a cow you technically own. Clever, right? By selling shares of their cows rather than the milk itself, some Amish farmers have found a legal loophole big enough to drive a milk truck through. It's like having joint custody of a cow, except you never have to feed it or clean up after it. Currently, 43 states have their own unique sets of rules about raw milk sales, creating a patchwork of regulations that's more complicated than a quilting pattern. Some states allow sales on farms only, others permit retail sales, and some ban it entirely. For Amish farmers trying to maintain their traditional dairy practices, it's like playing a game of chess where the rules change depending on which square you're standing on. The stakes are surprisingly high in this milk game. That $100,000 fine mentioned earlier, that actually happened when an Amish farmer's artisanal cheese crossed state lines. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. A single wheel of carefully crafted cheese getting the same legal treatment as contraband. It's enough to make you wonder if there are cheese-sniffing dogs at state borders. But here's the thing. Many Amish dairy farmers aren't just being stubborn about tradition. They genuinely believe that raw milk products are healthier and more natural than their pasteurized counterparts, and they've got quite a following of non-Amish customers who agree. These customers are willing to jump through all sorts of legal hoops just to get their hands on authentic Amish dairy products. Some even join underground milk clubs, which sounds like either the most wholesome or the most bizarre secret society ever, depending on how you look at it. To navigate this complex legal landscape, Amish farmers have become surprisingly savvy. They know exactly which products they can sell, where, and under what circumstances. Some have even started labeling their products as pet food to avoid certain regulations, though we all know Fluffy isn't the one enjoying that artisanal cheese. Speaking of working around regulations, you wouldn't believe what's happening in Amish workshops. While their dairy practices might raise eyebrows at the FDA, their woodworking methods would give OSHA inspectors a heart attack. Let's just say those beautiful handcrafted furniture pieces come with their own set of workplace safety interpretations. If you think OSHA inspectors get nervous about traditional workshops, you should see them walk into an Amish one. These woodworking havens are like stepping back in time, except instead of the cozy nostalgia you might expect, you'll find a collection of practices that would make a modern safety inspector reach for their citation book and a stiff drink. Picture this. Skilled craftsmen working with modified power tools, no safety guards in sight, and a training system that would give child labor laws a run for their money. These workshops are where those beautiful handcrafted furniture pieces come from. But they're also where modern safety regulations go to die. It's like a workplace safety rebel's paradise, except everyone's wearing suspenders and straw hats. The power tools themselves are something to behold. Since many Amish communities don't use electricity from the grid, they've gotten creative with their equipment. Think air-powered tools running off diesel compressors with modifications that would void every warranty and safety certification in existence. It's like the hot rod culture of the woodworking world, except instead of souping up cars, they're customizing table saws. But here's where things get really interesting: the apprenticeship system. In Amish workshops, it's common for young teenagers to learn the trade by working alongside experienced craftsmen. While this traditional method has produced generations of skilled woodworkers, it also happens to conflict with pretty much every child labor law on the books. It's vocational training meets tradition meets, let's hope the Labor Department doesn't drop by. The statistics on workshop accidents in these communities are hard to come by, mostly because they handle things internally. When accidents do happen, they're often dealt with through community support rather than workers' compensation claims. It's like having an informal insurance system where the coverage is paid in casseroles and barn-raising help rather than monthly premiums. Some Amish workshops have faced shutdowns when inspectors discover their operations. But here's the catch. They usually reopen, often with minimal changes. The Amish view these regulations as obstacles to maintaining their traditional way of life and passing skills to the next generation. To them, the risk of using a saw without modern safety features is less concerning than the risk of losing their cultural practices. The whole situation creates an interesting dilemma. These workshops produce some of the highest quality furniture you can find, made by craftsmen who've been learning their trade since they were old enough to hold a hammer. But they do it in ways that modern safety standards consider dangerous. It's like having to choose between preserving a traditional craft and following modern safety rules. And the Amish have clearly made their choice. What makes this even more fascinating is how these workshops manage to stay in business despite their non-compliance. Through a combination of exceptional quality, word-of-mouth reputation, and sometimes operating under the radar, They found ways to keep their traditional practices alive while selling to the modern world. It's like running a successful restaurant that ignores health codes, except instead of food, they're serving up heirloom quality furniture. From unregistered firearms to traditional workshops, the Amish way of life often finds itself dancing around modern regulations. What's fascinating isn't just what rules they bend, but how they've managed to preserve their traditions while doing it. Whether it's through clever workarounds like cow shares or maintaining their traditional craftsmanship methods, these communities have found ways to keep their cultural practices alive, even when they don't quite line up with today's laws.